to the IHC and to the German department for helping to bring me here and for the support. This will be a timely talk. This is also somewhat of an untimely talk, given the oil spill that you mentioned, which I guess has been revised. Last I saw was 21,000 gallons of oil, but I think it's been revised to 20,000 on a 9-mile oil slick. It might not be as untimely as the bumper sticker I saw in a car at the beach today, which said, "I love fossil fuels" on it, overlooking the beach, actually, where this oil slick is just lurking offshore. But there is something about that bumper sticker that I sort of like. I propose an exuberance, having this kind of exuberant relationship to the carboniferous, so to speak, but not just to petroleum. And so some of my observations, I think, today, which are untimely because they're not going to discuss petroleum per se, but they will look at relations, forms of relations with the carboniferous, more broadly through other rocks from this period, granite in particular I'll talk about, also chalk, that we can form other kind of libidinal investments in the earth that are not around oil and petroleum, and sort of looking at how literature has articulated those investments in the earth, in the carboniferous, beyond just oil. So I think on the one hand, the talk will be untimely because I won't discuss oil or petroleum or fossil fuels so much, but I will discuss other strata around them as a way of thinking about even a post-fossil fuel future, reducing our imaginative fixation on oil and that particular strata. So this is sort of an epigraph for my talk. It's from a recent essay by Rob Nixon. I will read a larger segment than this. He poses the question: for the Anthropocene hypothesis shakes the very idea of what it means to be human. If collectively we're a hurtling hunk of rock that feels, what does it mean for the stories we tell about our species and our place in life on Earth? What does it mean for the ethics of human actions? What are the imaginative and emotional pressures of opening up the human to geologic timescales? We're simply not accustomed, maybe even equipped, to conceive of human consequences across a vastly expanded temporal stage. How, and this is still Nixon's question, can we begin to internalize our role as Anthropocene actors, to inhabit that role feelingly? Rob Nixon's question about the transformation of the stories we tell of ourselves offers the starting point for my talk on literature and the Anthropocene. This is a talk about a broadly construed petrofiction, which is the term that novelist Amitav Ghosh developed in 1992, both to account for the oil encounter between the Americas and the Middle East, as it is staged in Abdelrahman Munif's Cities of Salt, and to draw attention to the relative scarcity of such encounters in literature. While a global oil culture drives the Anthropocene and informs virtually all aspects of life, I argue that to restrict petrofiction to a carboniferous imaginary hampers the root of petrofiction, this geologic fiction. It hampers the geologic imagination, and it hampers the ability to register the libidinal investments throughout the strata of the lithosphere, at least since Romanticism, and the ability to imagine a fossil fuel-free world. So maybe instead of petrofiction, I'm going to talk about petrofiction today. This will be a talk about geologic intimacy. It is about the incursion of the geologic into the sphere of the everyday, and vice versa. My talk will map some enmeshments of the lithic and the literary from the striations of the Dolomite sliding stones of Death Valley, whose intermittent movements across the racetrack playa attest both to the allure of and challenges to becoming attuned to a more than human mobility and the multiple temporalities of landscape. I take the term geologic intimacy from an exhibit by the artist Ilana Halperin, in which a number of laser-cut plywood stencils were immersed for 2.5 weeks into the runoff pool from the geothermal power plant feeding Iceland's Blue Lagoon to create geothermally occurring sculptures such as this one. I actually saw this exhibit not at the Geologic Intimacy one, but at an exhibition in the Charité Museum in Berlin for medical history, in which Halperin had assembled a massive collection of body stones, gallstones, bladder stones, into an installation which covered an entire wall. And the name of that exhibition is called We Form Geology. So a different form of geologic intimacy. While Halperin's sculptures, films, sketches, and installations probe the question of how we can internalize our role as Anthropocene actors, as those who form geology, at also a very individual level as well as a species-wide level, my talk today will look at several disparate literary fictions to look at how literature might elaborate the same. It is divided into 3 parts. 1, the allure of the inorganic, about the emergence of geologic self-understanding in the 19th century, principally in the age of Goethe. 2, the song of the earth, about some mutual mutations of the literary and the lithic. And 3, the lapidary style, about writing in a time of impending extinction. The allure of the inorganic. This perhaps unprecedented incursion of geologic objects into human experience has a counterpart in the perhaps unprecedented mobility, or perhaps unprecedented awareness of the mobility of the lithosphere. The south and west of Death Valley's sailing stones, Michael Heiser's levitated mass also stages the intrusion of a geologic object into the everyday, while the traversal by this 340-ton monolith of Los Angeles County over 11 days and 100 miles may have been well documented, and while its movements are entirely anthropogenic, this object on the move can be read as a choreography of the stone's own restiveness, really its restlessness, albeit accelerated so as to be perceivable at the human scale. At the same time as geologic objects are proliferating on the grounds of art museums, a number of artists are undertaking projects to reframe urban space within planetary movements and to recalibrate our sense of time in the city. This is New York City as a geologic force, a field guide to the geoarchitecture of New York, recently put out by Smudge Studios, which is Jamie Cruza and Elizabeth Elworth. A number of geosites around New York are presented in their full scale of deep time. One in particular that was interesting are the lions outside the New York Public Library, which we were talking about earlier, which are refashioned as sculpted fossils of prehistoric marine microbes and repositories of mineral intelligence. We can engage with the geopoetics of literature, though, as one engages with the geoarchitecture of the city, or as Jussi Parikka very recently engages with the geology of media. Just as Smudge Studio invites poetic responses to the built environment, elegantly articulated here in Olmsted's incision of 2 steps into a 450-million-year-old Manhattan schist textured by the advance of a Pleistocene glacier, inviting us to walk off the finely manicured paths and onto this stone. So too does literature offer passageways between radically different temporalities, rhythms, and scales. In the literature that I will focus on, geologic intimacy shifts from a physical intimacy, think about this particular piece, think about Heiser's levitated mass, to intimacy in the sense of how our inmost self-understanding is becoming geological, a situation in which, as Claire Kohlberg recently quipped, the personal is the geological. As an introduction both to my work and to the task of thinking at the geologic scale in literature, I want to turn to a 19th century novel, Wilhelm Meister's Years of Wandering, which indexes several important moments in our geological self-understanding. Given that we can identify a geologic to this late novel of Goethe, 1828, as Piper recently noted, I want to propose this novel as a petrofiction, perhaps as a petrofiction, one which describes an encounter with the Carboniferous, but in the form of granite rather than coal or shale. Goethe here reposing on granite blocks. This is also a shout out, as Susan mentioned, to my home department at UCSD as an undergraduate. This image in the upper right is Goethe in San Diego, and this is what you would see when you would log into the German website when I was an undergraduate there. Completely, I think, the European government's understanding of San Diego German studies, where history, which is in the original Tischbein portrait, on the ground there has been completely effaced. And you're left with Goethe sort of as Ozymandias, sort of in this desert without any historical markers. Granite, for Goethe, was an object of inquiry that extends from his two short but ecstatic 1785 texts on granite to his 1828 essay, Granite Work in Berlin. And interestingly, this work on granite from 1784 actually occurs at the start date, as Paul Crutzen proposes, for the Anthropocene, one of these mini markers, the invention, or maybe the patenting of James steam engine. So we have an interesting parallel here to the emergence of the Anthropocene, and I'll talk a bit more about why I think that date, that coincidence is important. In the 1785 text, which offers a sort of cultural history of granite, the layout of the page conforms to a stratigraphic sequence, proceeding in Goethe's geology from the oldest rock to the most recent, from granite to lava, which is mentioned then in the final paragraph. Here, granite serves as a medium for thought. Granite, in fact, is what incites thought, so to speak. Goethe writes that the immense masses of this stone influenced the Egyptians with thoughts of immense works. The earth here is already conceived of as a medium. Likewise, Goethe is believed to have considered these early texts as the inaugural pieces of an abandoned cosmic novel, Roman über das Weltall, that was inspired by Buffon's Epochs of Nature, which Goethe has regarded as a novel. Like the abandoned cosmic novel, The Years of Wandering, the novel of 1828, a sequel to the famous Bildungsroman, Wilhelm Meister's years of apprenticeship years, begins on a granite mountain. And from the outset, this novel itself exhibits what one character refers to as a Neigung zum Gestein, and which was originally translated as an enthusiasm for stone, English on the top, the German on the bottom, and then at the bottom, I think some other more playful translations that have on this term. So why call attention to this novel, particularly today, during the Anthropocene, or the period informally understood to be the Anthropocene, is that I think we already see a geologic subject or a geologization of subjectivity in this novel, which is coeval with the heroic age of geology, with the discovery of deep time. And it might, I argue, get at some of the questions that Nixon proposes around opening ourselves up to the imaginative pressures of the geologic at this period of really the nascent origin and emergence of the geological sciences, which happen to be, particularly in the German tradition, articulated in literature for reasons that I'll be explaining in a second. This passionate interest in rocks, this enthusiasm for stones, goes beyond a child's amusement or a collector's enthusiasm. Felix is Wilhelm's son, who's drawn to this box of stones. I should mention in passing too, Goethe was, I learned a new word yesterday in J.J. Cohen's essay, geophilic. He had a certain geophilia, which was manifested in a collection of over 20,000 individual specimens. But this Neigung zum Gestein, this enthusiasm for stones, I want to argue, is more than just a collector's enthusiasm. This allure of the inorganic also suggests an ontologically precarious propensity of life toward an inorganic state. Heterogeneous and xenophilic, this Neigung contains at least 4 variant readings within the context of a geologic turn in the age of Goethe. It is the magnetic attraction of stones that for Goethe indicates the hangover of a primordial era in which the interaction between organic and inorganic forms was more dynamic. It consists in an erotic affection for a mineral other, which is observable in a character in the novel called Mountain, who only wants to spend time in the mountain. It partakes in a widely held 18th century belief in the tendency of the planet's climate towards a crystalline state of absolute zero, as proposed by Charles Buffon in his 1778 Epochs of Nature, which of course may have inspired this abandoned novel by Goethe, as well as many of the cold worlds of Romanticism. And this Naigu also consists of the draw of minerals in an emerging capitalist system based on resource extraction, while also literalizing a reification of social relations in such a system. The popular literary motif of the cold heart, which was disseminated throughout the age of Goethe, but was also the name of a particular fairy tale, 1827, by Wilhelm Hauff, can be read quite effectively as an allegory of such capitalist exchange. In all of these tales of romantic rocks, luring young men from the flatlands to the mountains and mines, I'm interested in this polymorphous Naigu, again as erotic inclination, as economic draw, but perhaps most so as an ecological tendency towards the inorganic that problematizes any clear distinction between organic and inorganic life. Insofar as ecological thinking today widely takes the form of what Timothy Morton calls a humiliating descent towards what is rather abstractly called the earth, this unsettling inclination of Goethe's late novel positions him as our forerunner. The humiliation that the Years of Wandering charts is a blow to anthroponarcissism, a decentering of the primacy of the human along the lines of the Kränkungen that Freud lays out in A Difficulty in Psychoanalysis. And it also charts a humiliation in the literal sense of a movement of becoming humus, becoming earth, and Neigung zum Gestein. Goethe's novel has a formal inclination towards the inorganic, and this might be one of the interesting ways in which the earth at this time incited a literary development. In an attempt to dismiss the Years of Wandering, the critic Emil Steiger highlights exactly those qualities that made it so alluring for modernists. He writes, "The Years of Wandering became a receptacle into which the poet intended to put all possible sorts of things which otherwise would have been lost among his papers or would have been scattered in unappealingly individual writings. Here there is no thought of organic formation, of classical mindfulness and unity. It's an inorganic novel, and I understand that to mean, in a broad sense, unbounded, not oriented towards unity. It was a novel which is shot through with interpolated novellas. I think there's 6 interpolated novellas in there, multiple series of aphorisms, multiple lyrical connections, collections. It is really a receptacle into which all of these items were put. While the novel itself was something of a minor scandal, for the reasons that this Emil Steiger has just now elaborated, it itself is scandalized by stones. Already in the opening lines of this inorganic novel, we see it overwhelmed by threatening inorganic realm. There's the opening line in German, one translation, and then my translation below. In the shadow of an imposing cliff, Wilhelm sat on a chilling, consequential spot where the steep mountain path quickly turned around a corner towards the valley below. Commentators, most notably Andrew Piper, have noted that the sheer vertical perspective of this and many similar scenes in the novel articulates an emerging cartographic and stratigraphic imaginary, a new spatial awareness encompassing the spatialization of time, so into strata, and the temporalization of nature is beginning to emerge from the vertical perspective afforded by the sheer granite mountains and cliffs of the Harz Mountains and the Fichtel Mountains in the German tradition. Moreover, in the very year that Goethe publishes the first version of the Years of Wandering, 1821, the first geological map of Germany appears, which is dedicated to Goethe, and he in fact provides the color scheme. Together with the new novel form, these maps contribute to what Piper calls a reorientation of the perception of space itself, a new cartographic vision that allows for the temporalization of the Earth's surface and the geologization of human experience. So in this period, cultural self-understanding really becomes to be mediated by a stratigraphic imaginary that had been borrowed from the emerging earth sciences and is extensively elaborated, and I would even say co-articulated in artistic and literary representations of cliffs and mines. You get in this time in particular a notion of a deep self, of romanticism, that I would argue is underpinned by some of these geological investigations. And at this point too, as has already been said about this 19th century novel, a geologization of subjectivity. In Goethe's work, granite then becomes coded, as Piper says, a key site to explore new forms of perception, particularly through the cliff faces, through the sense of a depth on which the human stands, but which is also extremely culturally coded and has been, in fact, throughout history, according to Goethe. Yet, in the years of wandering, the form of granite is not only in the sheer monolithic mountains, but it also of erratically displaced blocks of granite. Think of the sailing stones that I showed initially. And these really frustrated Goethe from his inquiries from 1784 to 1828. And I'll just run through right here an image which is mentioned in a piece by Goethe, Granite Works in Berlin, that is written right as he's completing the years of wandering. This was a block that was found outside of Berlin, along with a bunch of other similar blocks, and which was in the process of being shipped apart, blasted apart, and turned into this massive basin, which you can still see in Berlin today in front of the old National Gallery. It's the kind of the levitated mass of its time. It's kind of remarkable because it was 10 miles outside of Germany. It's fashioned down into this bowl, transported by ship into Berlin, and then polished on site for 2 years, and then installed before the National Gallery in the Berliner Lustgarten. Kind of a remarkable work of geoengineering of its time, you could say. But what Goethe's really interested in this essay, even though it's an art historical essay, is this original block and how it got there and what it's doing there. And in fact, this really perturbed him, and I would argue too, perturbed the novel. And I would also make a point here too that in late 18th and early 19th century, a lot is made of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 and how this was really important for the formation of the modern subject. But in fact, what I argue elsewhere is that these stones, which are not nearly as spectacular as the earthquake, actually played potentially even a larger role in the formation of the modern subject, because they towed in their wake, so to speak, the emergence of glacial theory, the discovery that there were previous ice ages. This piece of granite, which was referred to as fine Prussian granite, was in fact scoured off of a cliff in Scandinavia by a mile-thick continental ice sheet and deposited in this area where the glacier melted. And so in trying to trace out how this stranded object got to where it was, the researchers stumbled across the glacial theory, ice ages, and even the proposal of deep time. This was one of the real main pieces of evidence for a proposal that the Earth was a lot older than 6,000 years. And insofar as this object, or these objects, which were really promoted then, a sort of a revolution in Thomas Kuhn's paradigm, a scientific revolution, it also, I think, asks us to recalibrate our aesthetics, to account for the inordinate role played by these aberrant, unconsolidated, non-spectacular, and not particularly monumental objects. So turning our eyes maybe a little bit away from the earthquakes and the mountains, which we know played such a role, and in these other objects, which are not nearly as spectacular. And so I actually think that this opening line, that's why I made this other translation here, is in fact, could be construed as a huge rock rather than a cliff. And what's important about this is that this huge rock, this Felsen in German, which can go either way, could in fact be such an erratic block. And so why that becomes important is one, it shows the importance of these objects in Goethe's thought, but two, if we construe this looming object in the opening line as a block rather than a cliff, it articulates another geological subjectivity, and another petrofiction, one that takes place less around fixed stratifications of granite and more around the plotting of an erratic mobility. Keeping in mind the frame narrative of the years of wandering, which follows a protagonist who cannot remain in one place for more than 3 days, the erratic imaginary of the novel could be said to be underpinned by a sense of the erraticness of the earth. The placement of this sedentary wanderer, in which particularly in German you can see that the path itself is in movement, where the earth in way itself is in movement, suggests that the novel is not only interested in human mobility and development. The wandering that is announced in the title does not only refer to Wilhelm's wandering, but also that of geologic objects. The itinerant itself in the novel is in part, I would argue, a geomorphic one. So rather than just seeing the earth anthropomorphized as something underway, something in movement, based upon their emerging mobility in Germany of the 19th century, I think we can turn it around and see it the other way around. Humans as geomorphized to a certain extent, which also would fit with this strange character who's named after a mountain and is kind of a poet geologist and seems to be himself somewhat inorganic. I could perform a reading which would really extend this throughout the novel and see to what extent a geologic subject or subjectivity is in fact underpinned in the entire novel, but I'll skip over that. I'll also skip over this passage, which is from a mountain festival later in the novel, which has been proposed as one of the earliest theories of the Ice Age, when in fact 2 or 3 quiet guests are trying to account for these stranded objects of the kind that I showed in the earlier slide in Berlin, and actually proposed a sort of an ice raft or glacial theory, which led 2 real prominent glaciologists, Swiss glaciologists, in decades after the novel to propose that the theory of the Ice Age was most clearly proposed in this novel, and in fact where a sort of scientific consensus found in the novel had approximated a glacial theory and a theory of the Ice Age in the novel. But I'll skip over that because, one, we're really not in the Anthropocene yet. One important, I think, observation here is that these objects, while they have been read as having opened up deep time, opened up the history of the Earth, also point forward to and anticipate the unsettled climactic future of the planet. So on the one hand, they show that a lot of time had to elapse for this entire area of the planet to be covered in ice and glaciers and then recede. While looking backwards, they open up then this quote deep time. They also project into the future, a future volatility, and show and suggest that the Earth's climate is not as stable as it was thought to be at that moment in the 19th century. So coming to the second section, the Song of the Earth. While Goethe's 1829 novel prefigures some of the coming transformation in the stories we tell about ourselves, it also prefigures our changing understanding of story, of literature, and of the earth. As Bill McKibben has recently argued, we're no longer living on the earth, but the earth. A silent mutation which signals the withdrawal of the familiarity of the earth as a home, habitat, and stable point of reference for environmental thought, McKibben writes. Where every day less the oasis and more the desert. The world hasn't ended, but the world as we know it has, even if we don't quite know it yet. We imagine that we still live back on that old planet, that the disturbances we see around us are the old random and freakish kind, but they're not. It's a different place, a different planet. Like the Anthropocene diagnostic, Earth, with 2 A's, marks the profound and far-reaching transformations of a primary geophysical signifier. If to speak of the Earth in the Anthropocene is to speak of a ruptured reference, what does it mean to speak of story or literature in the Anthropocene? And here, after a slightly long introduction, I get to the focus of this talk. This silent mutation of Earth into Earth means that we might have to evoke it not through song, but through noise. Similarly, Susi Parika has recently written in Geology of Media, 2015, the scale of geological durations exposed in the 19th century, quote, demands an understanding of story that is radically different from the usual meaning of storytelling with which we usually engage in the humanities. Moreover, Parika writes, this story is likely to contain fewer words and more asignifying semiotic matter, perhaps more mutations, like this A in Earth. And so I think the question arises, how could the geochronological unit of the Anthropocene, already spanning hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years, provide a perspective in which literature would still be legible or even legitimate as an expression of the human condition in a time of climate change? According to an array of critical voices, it might not. Recently, Tom Cohen has argued that the time of climate change is not of literature, but rather of cinematic time, and an inhuman, machinic, and interrupted temporality. While Ursula Heise has suggested that a database aesthetic affords more possibilities to register and represent the current mass extinction of biodiversity than traditional narratives of nature writing. And an epoch where the climatic, in general, and what issues from it has become, to quote Cohen again, radically counterlinear, a mutating hive of feedback loops of counter-referential force lines, tensions, and transferences, literature appears as an anachronism, a medium that is out of time, inapt to convey the geologic timescales in which humanity now registers itself. Instead of determining how or where literature has been outstripped by the weird temporalities of the cinema or the aesthetics of the database, it can be pointed out that the concept of literature, like the concept of nature or of the earth, does not always arrive intact in the 21st century, but rather mutagenized. 3 examples spring to mind. Maybe it'd be great if people had others in mind. Lithorature by Ross Chambers is one. Lithorature is a Jacques Lacan. And also what Thomas Shestag, Lost Single Line by Benjamin, refers to as lithorature. I was asked many times if that was a typo. And yes and no, it is supposed to be lithorature. These isotopes of literature point to an entanglement of the lithic and the literary, of litter and letter. This entanglement is acutely framed by the Anthropocene and is registered in the progressive withdrawal of an intact reference to the earth, to a stable ground, to a tenable concept of nature, to literature. And so I think the task today is to think together the ongoing mutations of the earth and the Anthropocene with some of these mutations of literature. I emphasize this silent mutation. I imagine that it's a silent mutation because it reminds me of a line by Max Sebel in his long poem After Nature, After Natur, where he writes, the silent mutations clear a way to the future. The German is a more convoluted phrase. Es bahnen die stillen Mutationen den Weg in die Zukunft. And he's writing right now about the River Irwell in Manchester. So we're in the heart of industrial capitalism, which is also one of the potential origins of the Anthropocene. And he's writing about the dead zone in this river, still in 1988 when he's writing this. But he writes that the silent mutations clear a way to the future. And why I'm interested in the silence of it, one, which reminds me of course, Rachel Carson's work on the Allegheny River and the Silent Spring, which also has a poetic reference to, but also the sense of a future, that there is a future to these silent mutations, and we're not just working with a narrative of decline, but one of mutation, and one of, as he will explore later in the poem, one of degeneration, but also understood, I think, in a less normative sense in the sense of becoming other than one's kind, in the sense of mutation. So some of these mutations, I'll just throw these out really quick. Lithorature, the name of a work by Ross Chambers, where he refers to a genre of modern literature marked by a counter-disciplinary resistance to what he calls prevailing structures of time and space. Literature, through a loss of narrative shape, for Chambers becomes receptive to a certain waywardness, And I would argue this waywardness is not particular to the human, but is exhibited in the waywardness of all of the stones that I showed at the beginning, the waywardness of these pieces of granite, which seem to be resting, but were maybe just on one station of a longer journey that captivated Goethe. The waywardness of the literary object for Walter Benjamin, as I'll discuss in a minute, and even the eccentric characters that inhabit climate change fiction today. Perhaps a more pertinent mutation for the Anthropocene, Lacan's essay Lithorature, translated roughly as erasure land, can be read as a mutilated marker of the ongoing obliteration of the surface of the earth. Littera is obliteration, earth, terra. In proposing that littera, a signifying traces of obliteration, comprise literature, Lacan comes close to endorsing the new understanding of story that Jussi Parikka proposes in a quote I read just a minute ago. I would propose to align Lacan's devious littérature and his attention to these sliding signifiers with the shifting reference to the literary since deconstruction, in which writing and the literary come to encompass inhuman traces in texts, in the wake of which, as Claire Colbrook recently wrote in Death of the Post-Human, we can think of texts as, quote, remaining unread, dead objects without authors or audiences, encountered as marks or traces without animating hand. Or how, as Nigel Clark recently argued in an essay, Speculative Geophysics in the Anthropocene, Derrida's logic of the trace was always intended to apply to fields beyond the human. And thus, to continue with Clark for a second, a more expansive concept of writing might include, quote, the inscriptions made by plants, animals, and rocks on or as landscape. Or as J.J. Cohen writes in a work I just found yesterday, Geophilia, geographesis, in which human hand and lithic potency compose a petric duet. As the formalization of the Anthropocene will come down to finding a reliable signature of human activity in the rock record, a signature which may be equated with 17th century genocide and a corresponding dip in global CO2 levels, in which so much land that was farmed or under management then reverted back to a forest state. Or if the signature is associated with the sixth extinction and a glaring absence of future fossil records, the Anthropocene thesis can point towards such a disanthropic narrative and the expansion of a concept of writing that cannot be traced back to self-furthering life, such as literature. I wanted to tack on here too a piece from the 70s by Roger Caillois, The Writing of Stones, where if we take the earth as a hurtling hunk of rock that feels, I propose, can we also take it as a hurtling hunk of rock that writes and is written upon by all manner of living and non-living things? Already in 1970, in The Writing of Stones, Caillois has speculated that one might list all the styles of human art and not find one without its parallel in mineral nature, unquote. He cites the natural paintings that appear in some of the polished cross-sections of panels of excavated Tuscan marble, the surfaces of which seem to depict stylized landscapes. That's not the best example, but he has some really remarkable ones in there. And where he writes that the mineral kingdom seems to have already foreshadowed somewhere in the depths of its rock every conceivable image yet to be painted by a human artist. Now I come really to penultimate section, the lapidary style. This is another image from Caillois' Writing of Stones. So to return to the ineptitude of literature from Cohen and Heise, which I think is also maybe a way of talking about the potency of stone, and the diminution of the literary object in a time of planetary crisis. Really, what can literature do? How can literature represent something whose scale so much surpasses the human and any human narrative? And to think that question together with this mutations of the literary and the lithic, I want to turn to a critical text written during what was for many the collapse of the world, in German, the Weltuntergang. So So I turn now to Walter Benjamin's 1939 commentaries on poems by Brecht, which I think offers a primer for reading in a time of impending planetary collapse, as mediated through critical reflections on the loss of measure, deranged temporalities, and the loss of a proper scale of reading. Benjamin's attention in this commentary is drawn to what he calls the lapidary style of poem in Bertolt Brecht's Deutsche Kriegsfibel. So this is a German war primer, is the typical translation. And here Benjamin will refer not to a more popular collection of photo epigrams, which Brecht cut out during World War II and then published under this name, German War Primer, in 1955, but rather to an earlier collection of poems from 1939 collected in Brecht's Svenborger Poems collection. By lapidary, Benjamin refers both to a concise style of expression wrought by the material conditions of laboriously inscribing letters in stone, and to an awareness that lines inscribed in stone for future generations must be incisive as possible. For the most part, Brecht's poems in this collection are 4-line epigrams. However, Benjamin asks, to what does the lapidary style of Brecht's war primer poems correspond in an age when this style has become largely detached from the material conditions of inscribing letters in stone? It lacks any apparent correspondences, and in adopting a style that has outlasted the material conditions for which it was developed, this writing style appears anachronistic. Its brevity is immoderate, and a number of such contradictions will animate Benjamin's commentary. In that commentary presupposes the authority and classical status of the commented text, Benjamin duly observes the anachronism of writing a commentary on a contemporary anti-authoritarian lyric poetry. Benjamin's writing this in the year of its publication. Yet he also insists on the legitimacy of this practice through the knowledge, quote, that the coming day could bring destruction on a scale of such magnitude that yesterday's texts and productions will seem as though separated from us by centuries. This, struck a nerve with me, this 1939 text. I'm reading this today. The derangement of temporality in the time of war offers a provisional legitimization of his undertaking to write such a commentary. Both the anticipation of destruction and the unraveling of a relatively fixed temporal and spatial scales that he indicates pertains all the more today, and an epoch that has earned the epithet of the Anthropocene, this time of new man. If we invent an etymon, it could be Anthropocenic. In the context and time of global ecological catastrophe, a return to Benjamin's remarks in the commentary form is warranted, given that, as Timothy Clark argues in a recent essay on scale, quote, inherited and currently dominant modes of reading in literary and cultural criticism remain blind to questions of scale, unquote. The urgency in addressing this blindness, according to Clark, derives from the degree to which climate change, quote, disrupts the scale at which one must think, skews categories of internal and external, and resists inherited closed economies of accounting or explanation, unquote, including liberal, individualist, and anthropocentric traditions in political thought and literary criticism. Even though most thought about literature and culture is taking place on a human or national scale, unable to register or otherwise respond to environmental emergencies of the long term, Clark concludes that an adequate response of literary criticism to climate change will not take the form of what he calls inventing some new method of reading per se, for its most prominent effect is of a derangement of scales that is also an implosion of intellectual competencies. That's Clark's argument. And interestingly, that's more or less the paradox that Benjamin discovers in this 1939 commentary. Dominant modes of reading are blind to questions of scale, and yet their ability to address a derangement of scale does not require the development of new methods of reading. So this anti-authoritarian contemporary poetry, and Benjamin's going to apply this commentary form to it in order to read this. This trick, as Benjamin writes, and as Clark reasserts, is not to find an apt mode of reading, but instead to understand and affirm the virtual ineptitude of any reading. And so regarding his commentary, Benjamin reflects the commentary, Benjamin, which is such a tight fit today, may hang like classical drapery tomorrow. Where it might seem almost indecently precise now, it could be full of mystery tomorrow. So I think Benjamin here in a way is charting what Timothy Morton will call an age of asymmetry, hyperobjects, but avant la lettre, so to speak. And it's one in which he is enmeshed. And also to skip to the poem itself that I'm interested in German at the top, my translation at the bottom. On the wall stood in chalk, "They want war. The one who wrote it has already fallen." Only amounting to 5 sentences, the poem is 4 lines, Benjamin's commentary is only 5 sentences, it's nevertheless inordinately sensitive to these lines and the fraught situation they describe. At the same time, since we are facing a global catastrophe of an entirely different order today, one whose traces are recorded in a layer of carbon that will outlast the species that left them, according to the Anthropocene hypothesis, Benjamin's remarks in this lapidary poem want further commentary. Those remarks and the scale they adopt no longer fit the poem that today, I argue, can be read as an allegory of the Anthropocene, about the letter. It's, as I would suggest, a poem about reading the traces that outlast the one or ones that left them. Reading the shortcomings of Benjamin's commentary, I think, though, is a way of acknowledging its insight, since the commentary not only anticipates but induces those deficiencies from the outset. This is Benjamin's commentary. The first line of the poem could preface each of the poem in the war primer. Their inscriptions are made not for stone, like those of the Romans, but like those of the outlawed fighters, for palisades. Accordingly, the character, this is still Benjamin, the character of the war primer can be seen as arising from a unique contradiction. Words which through their poetic form will conceivably survive the coming apocalypse, in German, den kommenden Weltuntergang zu überdauern. Words which through their poetic form will conceivably survive the coming apocalypse preserve the gesture of a message hastily scrawled on a fence by someone fleeing his enemies. The extraordinary artistic achievement of these sentences composed of primitive words resides in this contradiction. A proletarian, at the mercy of the Reign and Gestapo agents, scribbles some words on a wall with chalk, and the poet invests them with Horace's Ire perennius, more lasting than bronze. Unquote. So what is at stake in Brecht's poem is, for Benjamin, not survival as such. In this sense, the poem about the loss of life might also be about the loss of biological life as a viable concept to convey the transmission of language across generations. It is a primer for writing as well as reading during a Weltuntergang, the downfall not just of this or that individual, but of the world itself. It is a primer for a time of war as well as a time of extinction. Accordingly, it is not the case for Benjamin that the words might survive a catastrophe, and this is the translation in the selected writings, but rather that they might endure it. It is a matter of Überdauern rather than Überleben. That is to say, the logic of this poetry, and by extension here the logic of literature, is not only of the living bios, but perhaps here closer to the obdurate, inorganic, geos. This subtle yet forceful shift from outliving to outlasting a catastrophe establishes the basis for what Weichi Dimmock has recently referred to as a planetary literature. Dimmock's essay on the temporally and spatially extended life of literary objects, for her exemplified in the case of Mandelstam's reception of Dante, demonstrates how literature surpasses the finite scope of the nation and can come to encompass the entire planet. Similar to Benjamin's pointed remarks on words outlasting a global catastrophe, Dimmock regards literature as an artificial form of life and sees in it, quote, an insult and an affront to the finiteness that is the norm of biological organisms and territorial jurisdictions. For Dimmock, the durability of literature is due to its planetary form, which is forged through translation and the resulting availability of texts for heterogeneous readership. Benjamin, on the other hand, chalks up the durability of certain texts to their poetic form, by which he means their lapidary style. Given that words outlast the global catastrophe in this way, what do they actually retain? Benjamin's word here is festhalten. What do they retain? They retain an echo of the classical past. By situating these words within what Benjamin calls an inscription style, they evoke a continuum between modernity and antiquity, and with it an expanded set of coordinates for reading. Less as physical inscriptions, this is chalk, and more as gestures of a pithy citability, they speak to the portability of literary language. They, both Benjamin and Brecht's words, also register the real and present threat of detention, another form of festhalten, that hung over their heads at the time of writing. The words are shot through with fears of political persecution and arrest. Intertwined with the celebration of the portability of words is the author's awareness of their own deportability. But these chalk lines also retain other traces, traces which extend beyond the context of the poem and back to another extinction event, one which took place some 66 million years ago. In line with Benjamin, Clark, and Dimmock's injunction to consider the multiple and contradictory frames in which the literary texts are embedded, a commentary on these lines today, I suggest, cannot fail to observe how the medium of chalk, so here Kreide, brings into play another set of spatial and temporal coordinates, namely those of the Cretaceous period, in German the Kreidezeit, a period in the geological timescale characterized by the deposition of immense chalk beds in northwestern Europe, and lasting from approximately 145 to 66 million years ago, at which point the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event took place, in which 3/4 of plant and animal species went extinct. Those moribund lines written in chalk by someone who has already fallen register extinction as a condition for their possibility and legibility, just as they anticipate the question of the Anthropocene, the problem of how to read what will have been the remains of an extinct species, which enthralls us today. In the case of these chalk lines, the lithic medium is the message. Its didacticism, these were didactic poems, and Benjamin's commentary is itself very didactic. This didacticism lies not only in the words one writes, but also in what a material eco-criticism would call storied matter, in which Serenella Iofoino and Serpil Opperman glossed speaking, quote, matter as a text, as a site of narrativity, a storied matter, a corporeal palimpsest in which stories are inscribed. The lapidary style remains forceful today, not just for its brevity, but because it archives and animates, whether in bronze or in chalk or in plastic, what was thought to be lost to posterity. In this way, the problem of Brecht's poem is the central problem driving the Anthropocene, the retention of what was not intended for posterity. The signature of the Anthropocene will not have been the inscriptions made in marble or the incisions made in the bedrock of the metropolis, but more so the enduring accidental monuments of the non-biodegradable artifacts and inscriptions that accrete and accumulate on the surface of the earth as an affront to the finitude of all individual authors, and indeed the entire species, whether we're talking about elevated levels of carbon in the rock record, a thin layer of nucleotides, or other chemical signatures unwittingly left behind by our species. Jump forward. I had epigrams for the Anthropocene, but I cut it down to just an epigram for the Anthropocene. And I realized too in this talk I've moved from, sort of charted this diminution of literature that Benjamin describes, moving from a novel to a poem, and really here just to a two-word epigram. As in a way, a certain degeneration of literature, of the literary object, as U.C. Parika has suggested, but I also want to recover maybe a more neutral sense of that as it becoming other to one's kind, from literature to a lithorature. I take epigram here, citing John Mackay's Inscription of Modernity, as a literary norm and as the ritual and quite physical practice out of which that norm emerged, specifically sepulchral and other commemorative kinds of place marking, such as burial markers along the road, votive sites, memorial carvings, and the like. Unquote. And so from the perspective of the Anthropocene, I think we can look at epigram or inscription as a mode of transitively writing the Anthropocene in terms of inscription style, how that's mutated today to think about all the different signatures and forms of inscription that are left on the surface of the earth. This somewhat stripped down notion of commemorative place marking, inscription as commemorative place marking, is in fact more or less how a lot of geologists understand the lithic signatures of the Anthropocene. Rather than speculating, though, on what material inscriptions will be our ultimate lithic legacy, I want to close with a recent text written in the lapidary style, Mark Bradford's Help Us, installed on the roof of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. And it was inspired by these spray-painted pleas on the houses of residents of the 9th Ward flooded in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And I actually discovered this completely accidentally while in Pittsburgh and looking for the Natural History Museum. And actually through satellite view of Google Maps, these words popped out at me from the top of the museum. At the bottom you see kind of more of a press photograph right after it was written. And right before coming down here, I took another screenshot in the upper right of how it looks today. So it's a piece that's fading. It's really anti-monumental inscription, but one that sticks with me and is sort of an epigram for the Anthropocene as I understand it. It's directed to an inhabitant of Air Force One, or an extraterrestrial intelligence, or a remote sensing satellite orbiting around the Earth. So you have a sort of a massive scaling up of the appellant to whom this is addressed, first from its initial use by individuals and families in New Orleans, to ostensibly the entire species, or even all of life. The relocation of this message hundreds of miles inland, nearly 1,000 feet above sea level rise, portends also the inland movement of future climate refugees. The shifting reference of the words help us. And I should also point out too that these are actually small white stones that Bradford has arranged into these words. The shifting reference of the words help us, unmoored from their original historical situation and resituated in the context of the planet's natural history, situate us within the same deranged temporality that Benjamin outlines in his commentary. And thus they expose the same ineptitude. What Benjamin writes about the Brecht poem, a proletarian at the mercy of the rain, and Gestapo agents scribble some words on a wall with chalk, and the poet invests them with Horace's Irae perennius. This can also be said about Mark Bradford's piece. And yet Bradford's work, like Brecht's, takes on a distinctly anti-monumental stance. While the lapidary style in his rooftop piece, which was created for a Life After Mars, or Life on Mars exhibition in the Natural History Museum, it can be extended to the production of artworks for non-human intelligence. Bradford's piece is very different from Trevor Paglen's Last Pictures project, which is also intended for non-human intelligence. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this project. Photographic images in the style of Brecht's war primer, in fact, press images of human life inscribed into archival discs and then set into geosynchronous orbit such that they will outlast all of planetary life, attached to a new satellite that was shot up into orbit around the Earth. I think, though, Bradford's piece is quite different from Paglen's in this sense that it's not monumental, it's not intended for posterity, and yet I think it still is an important instance of this lapidary style. From the faded chalk graffiti of an unlawful combatant, the lapidary style, I would argue, can be extended to these such inscriptions, these epigrams for the Anthropocene, and even extended to include the faint striations on the desert floor left by a sliding rock, the marks left by a restive lithosphere, the expressive nomadism of matter, and all of the other lapidary style that are themselves storied matter and whose movements tell stories, if only dimly understood. Thank you.